When I was leaving Wisconsin to come to the museum, I had one last day of trout fishing in the Marengo River and then dropped past Fred Swanson's Tavern. Fred, the proprietor, said, "I see in the press that you're going to go to New York." I said, "That's right." He said, "What kind of photographs are you going to make out there?" And I explained that I was not going to New York to make photographs and gave him a kind of crude, simple notion of what a curator did. And he frowned and he said, "Sounds to me as though you're trading in your shotgun for a game warden's license." And I mean, he really had put his finger right on it.
I shudder to think where photography would have gone in the last 30 years if we didn't have someone as visionary and as caring as John.
You know, a lot of what came out of photography in the 70s and the 80s came out of what John clearly articulated was the direction to go. And he did it so forcefully that it took a long time for anyone to even doubt it. And I think even the people that worked against what John was saying were still under his influence.
He's one of the handful of great art historian curators in any medium, in any museum, on both sides of the Atlantic this whole century.
John brought us around to thinking about what the photographer was doing and allowed us to see the process with which the photographer made his picture. And so the subjective part of the picture making became very much as important as the subject, and they became a kind of infinitely thin, transparent lamination of the photographer's subjective idea on the objective subject. And therefore, photography's never been the same because it is clearly now, as a result of Szarkowski's dialogue and the way he taught us to see, it is an art form of great consequence now.
I grew up in a small city called Ashland in Wisconsin on the south shore of Lake Superior. There were wonderful things to photograph in my hometown if I had been smart enough. The baseball culture was unbelievably good. You know, the teams with the names of the businesses on the backs of their uniforms that sponsored the player. When the Polish White Eagles played the Ashland Merchants, it was one of the great summer festivals. The industry of the town, the ore shipping industry, the boats that came in, even before the St. Lawrence Seaway, small boats came from all over the world. And sailors on the docks swore in all languages. I wanted a fancier looking camera, but my parents got me an ABC Brownie kit, which had a baby brownie and 3 little lacquered paper trays and some tubes with developer and hypo and so forth. So for the next year or so, the family bathroom was pretty frequently occupied by my darkroom. And finally, the family encouraged me to build a darkroom in the basement and get me out of their hair. None of the pictures that I made when I was in high school interest me at all. Very few sophisticated photographers understood that the quotidian life of a community was really the richest material. My first year in college, I made a sort of highly romantic college landscape, which is pretty good of its kind. It's nice for weather, gray, rainy. And of the pictures that I would want to seriously exhibit, they're all from the years after college. But I saw some things there. I remember seeing Dorothea Lange's picture, the woman looking out of the rear window of the cabriolet, the oval window with the wonderful ornamental, the wonderful S-shaped ornament behind the window. called End of an Era, and I thought, boy, if a photographer could do that, that's what I wanted to be. I totally misinterpreted the picture, of course. I thought, wasn't it terrific the way this photographer could sort of pin this mean old woman, this old bitch, to the board almost like a specimen moth, show her in her true colors, greedy, grasping, this rich, ungenerous person. And more than 30 years later, when I was working with Dorothea Lange on her retrospective at the museum, the first time I ever saw the full caption, the full title of the picture, it was End of an Era, Funeral Cortege in a Small Valley Town. And of course it changed the picture totally. It wasn't her car, it was the undertaker's car. It wasn't hardness of heart, it was grief on her face. But it was still just as good. I finally majored in art history because I liked to look at the pictures. I thought one might learn something about being a photographer from looking at good pictures, even if they were painted. John Fabian Kienitz was a young art history professor, and as I was leaving class one day, he said, stopped me, and he said, I gather you're interested in photography. And I said, no, I'm a photographer. And he said, okay, go down to the student co-op and buy this book. It was American Photographs, and I really couldn't make head nor tail of it. I mean, it seemed to me to be so artless. It was just, they were just clear, sharp, literal pictures. And I had considerable trouble wondering whether Kienitz was playing some kind of trick on me or whether he really thought this stuff was all that good. And then gradually, little by little, a few of the pictures began to become interesting. The one of the lady in the striped blouse in front of the barber shop with the stripes on the wall and the striped candy pull, it was easy to see, okay, there was some design in that one. But most of them were just facts. And that was a puzzle to me. But I'd paid for it, so I stuck with it, and it kept getting better, and it, in fact, still keeps getting better. It's one of the few books, perhaps the great photography book, and you can just keep looking at it and finding some nourishment in it. Now I know a good deal about the history of art, and I know a good deal about photography, and maybe there's some way of combining these two concerns, these two interests. I was enormously lucky and got a job as photographer for the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. During the time I was at the Walker, I became more and more interested in architecture and in Louis Sullivan. And then I read Kindergarten Chats, Sullivan's wonderful Socratic dialogue with the young architecture student. I couldn't wait to see a building by this guy. I mean, he was obviously so great and so intelligent and creative. And then got a chance to go to Buffalo to teach at the Albright Art School. And I knew that one of Sullivan's great skyscrapers was in Buffalo, the Prudential, the Guarantee originally. Also, it was the only job offer that I had. So for both of those good reasons, I went to Buffalo and taught at Albright for a couple of years and did a lot of photographing of the Prudential building, and decided that I wanted to do a book on it and 6 or 8 other of Sullivan's exceptional buildings.
When I looked at the work of Louis Sullivan, seen through John's eye, did I understand that he was a sort of an architectural, spatial photographer who was bringing to that part of the business, or that part of photography, a very different eye. He was not your ordinary architectural photographer who makes these architectonic pictures that are so dead. John had a kind of quick to his pictures. There was something that was surprising about them.
I met Frank Lloyd Wright through the dumbest kind of luck. I meant to write him and explain what I was doing. And then it got too late to write, and so I said, I'll call. And how can I call? How am I going to, how am I going to explain to this great man who does not always have time even for his equals, if any? How am I going to call him up and explain over the telephone why I want to see him? So maybe it would be better if I got closer. So I took the camera out of the trunk and put it on the tripod and began to try to photograph the foundation buildings, the old, what used to be the Hillside School. And a officious young apprentice came up and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I thought I'd photograph the building." And he said, "Is it just for your own use, or is it for public?" I said, "No, it's just for my own use." He said, "Oh, well, that's all right then, because if it was for publication, you'd have to see Mr. Wright." I said, "At second thought," I said, maybe I would want to publish it." And then he said, "Oh, you'll have to see Mr. He said, "There goes so-and-so with the pickup truck. Maybe you can get a ride with him back to the house." I got to what I gathered was the sort of outer office. So I sat there for 5 minutes, and then I began sort of wandering. But there weren't any doorways. There was just kind of a passage, and then the room got bigger again. And this big baritone booming voice said, "Yes, and who are you?" And I turned around, and here's Wright. I tried to explain who I was and what I was doing in what turned out to be his private drafting room. And did not, finally managed to get out the words, "Mr. Sullivan," and he said, "Louis Sullivan?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, I said, "Yes, I've photographed the Prudential Building in Buffalo." He said, "The Guarantee Building?" He said, "Yes, that's what I meant, the Guarantee Building." He said, "Are those, you have those? That's what you have there in your hand?" I said, "Yes." He looked at them. He went through the portfolio, 15 prints, I think. And he went through and took out about every third picture. And I thought, God, he's saving these for ceremonial burning. I mean, I'm not going to get out of here alive. I mean, I've really done something unspeakable. And when he had taken out 5 or 6 prints, and he closed the portfolio, and he said, "These are the best photographs I've ever seen of Louis Sullivan's architecture." He said, "I'll take these." I said, "Oh, Mr. Wright, take the whole thing, take the whole portfolio."
John had this very distinguished career as a photographer before he came to the museum, which there's no doubt in my mind was part of what enabled him to do what he did as a curator.
Recently, we did buy 2 pictures by John for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they were from the 50s, I believe, and they were black and white photographs that were made, you would say, relatively straightforwardly, but with great elegance. And one of them was an elevated view, and you could see the way the train track was important, the way the grain silo was important, the main street, and the whole social organization of the town. And again, with a great kind of tenderness towards the people who had created this. And the other picture was a picture of John's own backyard with his dog named Matthew Brady, with a bone in his mouth. And the backyard is this beautiful American idyll. Nobody but John could have made that picture because of the love that's in it.
When I got back to my headquarters in northern Wisconsin, there was a letter from the museum signed by a Monroe Wheeler, which said, doubtless I was aware of the museum's plans for its future photography program, and if by any chance I should be in the city, the museum would like to discuss their plans. with me. So I wrote back and said, no, I don't have any intention of being in New York in the near future, and under no circumstances could I get there before the ground freezes in Western Ontario, which I thought later, what Monroe must have thought some kind of exotic Midwesternism, such as I couldn't get there till hell freezes over. But he wrote back very politely, and he said, of course, the museum meant to make it clear that they would pay for your trip out, and late November would be fine. So I thought they probably had a job they wanted me to do, or conceivably, maybe they liked my work so much they wanted to do a show. So when I went to see René Darnancourt, and he said, I suppose you know why you're here. I said, no, Mr. Darnancourt, I have no idea why I'm here. And he looked at me, and then I think decided that I was either telling the truth or was a good liar, and either one would suit the museum's purposes equally well. It never occurred to me that I would actually take the job until I was on the plane on the way back, and I began thinking, well, it would be nutty. It really would be ludicrous. But if I did take it, what would I do? What would one do with a job like that for a few years, 3 years? And then I remember thinking, 6 years, absolute maximum. And then I would go back to my real work. But it turned out to be 29 years.
When John came on the scene, it was right after the magazine world was dominant. And as the magazine world was descending, John came along.
Before him was Steichen. And Steichen, as great a photographer as he was also a magazine photographer, a commercial photographer, a fashion photographer. And his vision of photography was somewhat sentimentalized. And in comes John, and he's this tough, Midwestern, lean, spare, pared down intelligence, looking at the most demanding characteristics and qualities of photography.
The museum, when I first got there, was still really remarkably small and could be run with a kind of informality. Alfred Barr, he was really dictator of the collections. In those days, a benevolent dictator, but everyone knew whose collection it was. Monroe Wheeler kept most of his records, I think, on the back of a envelope. There's a story about an exhibition that Philip Johnson had done, and Johnson had reason to call on Monroe Wheeler on some matter, and while he was there, I said, "Oh, about that show I just did, how did the cost finally turn out?" And Monroe opened a little notebook and said, "Oh, well, it came out, it cost $7,648. And Philip said, "Oh, how much was it budgeted for?" And Monroe turned the page, whether there was anything written on these pages or not, of course, and we will never know. He said, "It was budgeted for $2,500. And Philip said, "Oh, well then, 2,576 for, then I owe you $5,148. Is that right?" And Monroe said, "Yeah, that's what it comes out to me." So Philip sat down and wrote a check for the balance, which was a wonderful way to run a museum.
John was trying to draw a bead, it seemed to me, on the purity of the photographic idea. What was owed to photography? How does photography speak for itself as an art form, not as something that uses styles drawn from painting?
I decided that I wanted to do an exhibition about photography's basic formal characteristics. And it seemed to me that that you had to start with the kinds of decisions that photographers are inevitably confronted with, whatever their philosophical opinions, whatever their political opinions, whatever their aesthetic ideas. There are certain issues that have got to be confronted. Where do you go? What do you decide is your subject, the thing that you want to photograph? Where do you stand? When do you push the button? How do you decide what is in the picture and out of the picture? And that's basically what photography is about.
I never, ever would have become a photographer if I hadn't read The Photographer's Eye. I mean, he tricked me into thinking that photographers actually participate in the culture. And they weren't kind of lonely chess-playing, poetry reading recluses, that they really are.
John was the great fisherman, the great trout fisherman of photography. He stood in the stream, and all of photography flowed through the Museum of Modern Art. Every week they had their review. People brought in portfolios by the dozens. John and the gang looked at all these portfolios and took notes, kept a logbook on all of this. And then he would pick out fish now and again and say, look at that. That's beautiful. That's going to develop.
I decided I'd put a box of maybe 50 pictures together, and I brought them up to the museum.
He always used to say, why is it always 50 pictures? Is that your year's work, 50 pictures? Because everyone wanted to pare it down to their best. And usually, if you could make 50 pictures in a year, that's a picture a week. That's a lot.
And I very nervously walked in. And he was sitting there, sitting back in his chair and smoking a pipe. Of course, he was very relaxed, and I thought my head was going to explode.
He would sit and look at these photographs. And sometimes there would be quiet for 4 minutes, 5 minutes, as he's looking at one picture.
He had 6 pictures on the wall, 3 of mine and 3 I'd never seen before. And during the course of our conversation, he asked me what I thought and if I thought they were similar.
I was amazed at the courtesy with which he treated every photographer who came in, whether they were Andre Kertesz or just somebody who'd almost only exposed one roll of film.
So I guessed, and I guessed yes rather than no, thinking it's probably yes.
And then he might just look up and say, wow. And just do that, a kind of a smirk or something. And you realized that you had actually buried that little thing there, and no one else had seen it. But when John looked at the picture, he got to it, and he understood that you understood.
After I realized it was going very smoothly, I got the courage to say, pretty meekly, whose pictures are they? And John said, they're mine. And of course, that made me feel much, much better.
I remember saying to him, it's astonishing to me how generous you are with your time. And he said, you never can tell what's interesting, who's going to be interesting.
And in that moment is a kind of little synapse of intelligences going bzzz. And in that little bzzz is the game of photography. It's the game of sight.
He said he would like to have them for the collection, and then he went on to bargain me down to a ridiculously low price. I think I gave him 2, and he gave me $50 for 1, something like that. But, I would have probably paid to have them in the collection.
His invitation to the dance was what was so remarkable about him right from the beginning. He made you feel as if you were intelligent.
I looked out of my office toward the main room and saw a man coming in with 2 shopping bags. He looked a little bit like the poster of Willy Loman, an old man carrying these 2 bags, which must have included at least 500 photographs. And when he was gone, I asked, who was that? And she said, that was Andre Kertesz. And I was astonished. I thought he had been dead forever. I mean, he was really not very old. I don't think he was 70, but had not been heard of for many years. He came to this country in '35. When the photojournalism business didn't work out, he went to work for Condé Nast, and he did House and Garden and et cetera, American Home, whatever their home magazines were. And he did that for about 20 years and didn't really return to his own work until he retired from Condé Nast about in the early 60s, and then began again doing his own work with enthusiasm. So that it was just dumb luck on my part that I happened to stumble across him at the time when he was resuming his own career as a serious artist.
John doesn't have much interest in photographic education as such. I think he thinks that life is the great educator and that photography might be a tool for helping you to find out who you are, as long as you don't think that that's what you're doing. And so by the same token, a child such as Lartigue, the French photographer, a child like Lartigue could be a great photographer, not just a curiosity, but a great photographer, because it's not necessary to have gone through some training, long, short, or academic, to be a great photographer. What's important is to have a need to say something to say, and the ability to pursue it tenaciously until you can express it properly. And Lartigue certainly managed that beautifully.
I had really not learned the rules of being a curator when I first saw Lartigue's photographs. I looked at the first couple of spreads, and the scrapbook's filled with tiny little contact prints and corners cut out so you could fit in another one. It looked much like an old-style yearbook, but the pictures were off the wall, wonderful. And instead of being very cool and saying, well, Charles, perhaps, who knows, we might be able to do something not too big. I instantly expressed my full enthusiasm. And it occurred to me later, that Charles came in, sort of hat in hand, asking me if I might not do some small favor for these photographs. By the time he left, I was imploring him, and he was holding the pat hand.
Looking at photographs, John's great book of about 100 pictures in the Museum of Modern Art collection was published in 1973. And of course, I didn't know him then. I bought it and I read it right away. I was actually a little bit disappointed at first because I was hoping it was going to be a history of photography. And I found here were these 100 essays about individual pictures. I didn't realize right away that, in fact, it is a history of photography. And then when I was in graduate school in the late 70s, I started reading the book again. And one day I saw John and I said, looking at photographs isn't really about photography at all. It's really about everything but photography. And he smiled and turned back to me and said, well, what do you think photography's about?
The history of photography is absolutely fascinating in the sense that, by and large, it's been put together by photographers who have come across bodies of work that they thought were remarkable. If it hadn't been for Ansel Adams in 1936 or thereabouts, writing Stieglitz and saying, Stieglitz, I have found an album of old 19th century photographs by a man named O'Sullivan, the best of which are as good as anything I've ever seen. And Stieglitz not knowing who O'Sullivan was. If it hadn't been for Bernice Abbott, how much would we know about Atget? Atget's work, if you look at it over a period of time and with care and sitting down, not standing up, walking from one picture to another in a gallery, it explains to you the process of photographic decision-making. I remember Winogrand once was visiting the museum, and on his way out, he walked past a table where there were covered with Atget prints. And he stopped and he said, he always knew where to stand. It's true, that is the essence of it, knowing where to stand, meaning also what do you address? What subjects do you address? And what is the relationship? What is the proper posture between the viewer and the subject? How close do you get? Is it really true what Robert Capa said, that if your pictures aren't any good, you're not close enough? No, it's not really true. sometimes the discretion, the sense of the proper relationship between the photographer and the subject is implicit somehow in the place that Atget finds to stand. Winogrand's work in no way negates the potentials of Atget's work. Winogrand was probably the photographer for whose work I was least prepared in terms of my own work, in terms of what I knew. I mean, in many ways, on the surface, it seemed to just throw out all the standards that I personally respected and adhered to. But it was so interesting, and it was so enormously rich and so full of life, by which I mean the kind of life that is in the photographs themselves, not just a life that is being alluded to, but a life that is being captured in the lineaments of the photograph itself. And so it never occurred to me to be impatient because of his sometimes rather casual attitude toward finishing, or about his people that would complain about his tilted horizons and his tilted verticals. And generally he wouldn't answer such questions. He'd just say, no, it's not. It's not tilted. The picture's not tilted. One day, finally, in desperation, there was someone accosted him about this in the department, and there was a picture on the wall, and he raised one corner of the framed picture on the wall. He said, "There, now the picture's tilted." And then once he said to me, he said, "No, there's always something in the picture that's not tilted." And of course, what he meant was to get in the picture what you want to get in the picture, you can't hold the camera back vertical at all times. You've got to tilt it, tilt. So you're not going to have parallel verticals, and you're going to have all kinds of things that look, to people accustomed to Renaissance conventions, like distortions. They're not really distortions, but they're unfamiliar applications of classical perspective. So that you have to find some other way to make the picture secure again. Far from being casual, he was working on problems that other people hadn't really quite recognized as existing yet.
John really believes in tradition. Tradition is an underground river that nurtures the roots of art, and there's so much to be learned from those who did it beautifully once before, whenever it was. And so John's support of Arbus is not atypical at all. He was interested in serious work, and that woman was serious.
Diane Arbus brought in a portfolio. I didn't like it very much. Her subjects were not really subjects. You could tell that she wasn't dealing with something that was very much in flux and would be gone in the next instant. It was, her subjects seemed to be very stable somehow. So when she came to pick up the portfolio, I talked to her, and I immediately became very fond of her. And because I liked her, I was much more frank about what I thought about the portfolio than I would have been if I hadn't. And I said, well, I don't think the pictures look like what they should look like in terms of what it seems to me you're probably interested in. And then she said, what do you mean? And I said, oh, how can you explain these things? I said, oh, do you know August Sander? She said, no, who's August Sander? So I got a Sander box of August Sander prints out of the collection and brought it into the office. It was like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, or whatever road that was, you know, where the epiphany came. I mean, she was, and I also showed her a book of Darius Kinsey's logging portraits. And of course, this kind of wonderful solemnity, seriousness, sense of purpose, sense of, you know, her pictures almost have that kind of sense of function in them, as though my function is to be a dwarf. My function is to be a pro-war sympathizer, like Kinsey's loggers and Sandra's pastry chefs, hod carriers. Although I think her work had already begun to find that direction. The fact that her subjects understood that she was interested in them, that she really was interested in them. And therefore, they, of course, are interested in her, because we're always interested in people who are interested in us. And occasionally, in the photograph itself, the posture, the expression, the whole character of the picture manages to express that sharing, that communion that goes on, that at her best went on between her and her subjects, and that's what makes those pictures remarkable, you know.
The Museum of Modern Art, under John Szarkowski, was the only museum that paid serious attention to her during her lifetime. The only one.
When I was a photographer, I did some of the worst color photography on record. I really had no clear notion of what color photography was for, except on a very obvious level. After all, learning to be a photographer was in very large part a matter of learning how to not see the purple necktie. The purple necktie was irrelevant to a black and white photographer, and if you didn't learn to recognize that fact, you might think that it had the same kind of emotional authority or compositional torque that it would have had if the picture was in color. So you learn how to see the world in black and white the way it really was.
When John was editing the several, there must have been a dozen carousels of slides made by a photographer from the South named William Eggleston. At that time, nobody had ever heard of Bill Eggleston. But John had somehow gotten wind of him and was impressed by him. And I remember sitting in the room with John as he selected the pictures. It was one picture of a man with a red airplane, and the man was standing next to the airplane, and he was just touching the side of the fuselage. And I said to John, I said, what is this about? And why did you pick this picture? And he said, oh, he said very tenderly, he said, but look how affectionate he is with that airplane.
First picture in the guide is one of those wonderful fawn-colored dogs drinking out of a muddy puddle in the middle of a more or less fawn-colored dirt road, and his pink tongue and that muddy puddle and that beautiful smooth, I mean, it is so luxurious, it is so physical. It's not an invention having to do with color relationships. It's the real world, and it's a real photograph. And Eggleston learned what the specific subject was that related to the whole big, broad subject matter of his life, his place, his part of the world, in terms of photographs in color. He figured out where to point the camera.
Remember that Ansel Adams was completely flummoxed, and he wrote John this despairing letter telling him that he really didn't understand this. It was in fact outrageous that John would support work that looked like this, that was so ordinary. So.
Towards the end of his tenure, when manipulated photography, stage-managed photography became more visible, people started to take potshots at him because he wasn't responding to that stuff. My view as a photographer was that most of the critics, all they wanted to do was interpret something. Oh, what the photographer means is this, and tell a little story. John wasn't interested in those little narratives. I don't think he felt that photography could really carry a narrative. And many of these people who criticized him were proponents of that kind of work precisely because that kind of work requires interpretation. And that's not what photography is only about, interpreting someone's ideas. You know, who's to say what a photograph means? If
you're going to be a curator, one cannot be too sensitive about bad reviews. One has to start with the assumption that you know more than they do, and so you forgive them. I mean, if they knew more than you knew, I mean, why would your positions not be reversed? But you know, you win some and lose some, and do regret never having done a big Friedlander show. We just did little pieces. And he's so astonishing, you know. He's probably the best we still have with good muscle tone. Astonishing performance for over, what, more than 30 years.
John Szarkowski's exhibitions were nothing if not superbly intelligent and cogently edited. There was never a picture too many. If anything, we sometimes left an exhibition of Szarkowski's with the sense that it was so good, why didn't it go on just a little bit longer? He was an extraordinary thinker about photography, and the way he thought about the pictures is how he hung the pictures, and therefore he drew from his audience the sense that they too were as bright and as interested in photography as the man who'd put the pictures on the wall. So there's a kind of intimacy of dialogue in a Szarkowski exhibition, which is ultimately very rewarding to the public.
I do believe that the most important thing is artistic success. I think there is such a thing as, even in the work of substantial artists, not all pictures are equal.
He believes in a kind of democracy, and I think that comes through in his selection of pictures, which can be very simple documentary pictures of without much monetary value, and that could hang right next to a picture which was a signature autographic piece of the most important kind in the history of photography. So the great masterpiece and the unknown minor piece might be considered equals as far as John was concerned.
I think there were things that John took a bead on that were in the essential qualities of what photography really was about. And then he opened that up. And it was in that opening, just a little wedge, you know, in the rest of this mundane use of photography. And that little wedge was filled with oxygen. And it was the thing that gave us all courage.
Certainly John would be allowed to identify with some of the great photographers that he's worked with. I think that probably there's an identification with Alfred Stieglitz, although I think John would heatedly deny it. But maybe there's also an identification with Atget in the sense that many of Atget's best pictures were made, when he was in his 60s. And John is of that same generation now and has allowed himself, finally, the time to go back to what he has always been his first love, which is photography.
I had made a few photographs of the barn while I was still working at the museum. About 1990, I decided that there were enough photographs to be made here to make a little book. And at that point, I began working on it in a concentrated and focused way. I would like to think that I am not prejudiced in favor of handmade things. I would prefer to think that I'm prejudiced in favor of well-made things. And this barn is a really well-made thing. I think that surely the lives of the people who lived here were hard, often unsparing in their requirements that they made of the people who lived them. But when you look at a structure done as well as this one is done, you think, all right, they were able to understand and appreciate and execute a well-made thing. I tell my students that you can't wait until you've got a great idea, because it's not a great idea until you get into it. Start working on something that you're interested in a little bit, or you think you might be interested in, and you explore it, and if it's the right subject for you, it becomes more interesting as you work, and the more you work, the more interesting it becomes. But you can't solve artistic problems in your head and then execute them. In real art, you never know what the answer is. You have to work toward it, and finally, when you can't go any further, you think that must be the answer. I don't need to take two. I know that exposure by heart.